Abbreviations. Part of the games industry in many ways. In the beginning, and that is because I'm quite old, I didn't even understand what LOL meant. I thought it was some kind of candy or something. Now it's just common language to say LOL, ha ha ha, that's LOL. At least in Danish. I know it sounds terrible. It is. But I find it rather funny when the abbreviation starts to be longer than a normal word. And that's a little bit the case here because we are going to talk about a TMORPG. I know for, I think, all of you, that's just a TMORPG. But I think it's quite funny that so many letters doesn't mean anything, but it means a lot. And what exactly it means for might and delights, that is what we're going to find out now. So, welcome, Jens.
Thank you.
Did you like my intro there?
Yeah, I really saw where you were going, and I didn't plan on sort of explaining the team or RPG part, but I think I'll have to add it now when I do the introductions.
I'm sorry if I ruined it for you. Sorry, man.
No, it's great.
I just thought it. I just want to say I'm really looking forward to Book of Travels, and I'm excited about you telling the world about it. So please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I will talk about the design process for the conflict in Book of Travels. So first I'll do some introductions and unveil this mysterious abbreviation. So just shortly, Might and Delight is an indie studio, and we were founded in 2010. We're mostly known for the Shelter series, but hopefully we're starting to get pretty known for Book of Travels as well. And our niche is sort of emotional and artsy games, you can say. And then for me, I'm the lead programmer of Book of Travels, but I also do a bunch of other stuff. So I will talk mostly as a systems designer for this talk. And previously, we've done an online project called Meadow, and that is sort of online shelter without any sort of conflict. It does have some loops of sort of socialization, exploration, and gathering that feed into each other. It also features emote-based communication and no text chat, so that is sort of an important part of Meadow that we brought into Book of Travels. I also called it a form in games clothing, which I'm pretty happy with, and it sort of emphasizes that the socialization is sort of the forefront of Meadow. And then we have Book of Travels. So what we mean by TMORPG is that, so T stands for tiny, and that means that we have few people per every server. And this sort of ties back to Meadow as well, that we found the number of players where it wasn't overcrowded and you could sort of find people to play with, but the meeting between players was still meaningful, and that is what we want to achieve with Book of Travels. Also, someone on YouTube called us D&D meets Journey, which I think is pretty fair, and a bit jealous that I didn't think of that. So we want the player connection that Journey presents, but it's also an RPG at its core, even though we take our own version on a lot of RPG concepts. So why conflict at all? Didn't you say this was a Serene game? Yeah, so I did question the need for this a lot. And like from my development career, I came directly from working on Meadow, which is completely non-violent. So I thought it was a bit like unnecessary or boring that we went the conflict routes. And I sort of argued with our creative director quite a bit with this. So then the argument that sort of won me over, so he comes from art and I come from tech, is that if he is supposed to draw a field that is empty, he will not just draw a field that has nothing in it, but he will draw these little bushes and sickly trees and sort of scatter them around to show how empty the field is. So the philosophy behind conflict in Book of Travels is that it's these flecks of dangers and darkness that lights up the rest of the world. And then we have a chance to say something with the conflict, from the mechanics of it and to how we present it and how NPCs talk about it. It just gives us another crayon in the box to paint with. And an example of what we do here is that in the civilized parts of the world, the only conventional way to get into conflict is with a form called duels. So that works like conflict gameplay would otherwise, but it stops the moment before anyone gets hurt. So this sort of care about human life is sort of a central part in this this culture that we created. And then we have to relate to this player meeting that I was talking about, that the socialization and that it feels meaningful to meet other players is sort of an important part and a design staple of Book of Travels. So conflict gameplay is not the main course, and it has to sort of stand back and let the meeting come first. Let's talk about some goals and limitations. So these are some things that we had in mind while designing conflict. So first of all, we really focus on the dramatics, and we sort of start with the presentational layer, and then we add sort of gameplay on top of that. We want it to be engaging but not fun, and by fun I mean a sort of cartoon violence-y sort of way. So an example is that I've talked to people making content around conflict, and I talked to audio about how it should sound when you win a conflict scenario. And if you think about the like happy fanfare when you win a combat situation in Final Fantasy, that is very much not what we want. So I've been saying angst and more angst when people have been asking me like, how should this look or how should this sound? And then we want conflict to have severity of consequences to sort of emphasize the dramatic part. So you can hurt your character, and you can get quite big losses from losing a combat scenario. So we hope that that dynamic will sort of feed into the dramatics. And then we want to give the players a lot of options to prepare for conflict. So you can see this big threat and then sort of run away and find some people to help you. You can brew some tea to boost your stats. And we want that gameplay to be sort of a dramatic lead up to the actual confrontation. And then, since this is very optional, we always want to give the players the ability to opt out at different stages. And then we have some format limitations. So the characters are pretty small and they're quite far away in perspective, so we can't really do too much with like showing things around the characters. The game is click to play in interface and in movement, so that needs to translate to conflict as well. It is online, so we can't really do things like pausing. We do think a lot about how elements will work both in a single player perspective and when you're playing cooperatively with someone. And we have chosen not to have PvP combat for the reason of the player meeting being what's important. Then we have a number of casuals in our fan group. So we have to think about elements like limited game literacy. But regardless of this, we would want to make it accessible and straightforward. And then we have the aspect of that we have no text chat. So the emotes need to be able to convey the actions that you can do in a conflict, and you need to be able to sort of communicate with your group effectively. And the combat actions cannot be too advanced to the degree that you can't communicate with others. And then regarding the target group, we've been thinking a lot about complexity balance. So if we see conflict gameplay as a range from cutscene to strategy game, where you can sort of pause and think about your actions for hours, we sort of want to be around here. So we do want it to be sort of more presentational and dramatic. And I mean, it's not turn-based, so it is real time. And on the other hand, we still want some player input that sort of means something to the outcome to actually reach our goals. So let's talk about some interactions. So when you assess your opponent in a regular RPG, you might see some color grading of how dangerous they are. You might see a level. And we don't really have conventional levels, so we have done a take that we call the combat ready action. And that means that you put your hand on your sword and you actively provoke nearby NPCs that will answer to that. At this point, we show some combat relevant stats, since levels are not applicable, that lets you sort of assess your power level towards them. And this also gives the player an ability to opt out at this stage. But let's have a look at how that looks in practice. So here we can see the combat ready actions, and there are some things to point out. So over the head we have this initiative timer, and that is a limitation on how quickly you can engage, and it also gives you a few seconds in this assessment mode. So under the character you can see these stats that we'll get into more later, that you use for this assessment. And here we see my full screen when I'm done with my initiative. So this red circle is the diameter of the threat. So if there are any combat compatible characters within this, they will react to me. So here I've done just that. I've found someone to fight me, and they have started their initiative against me. So here we can see that the player's initiative circle is not shown, but the NPC's is. So if any NPCs do react to you, the closest one will show. The closest one to the local player will show their initiative circle. And that is because if I assess here that I should remove myself from the situation, I can stop my initiative and run out of the NPC circle, and then they won't attack me. So some parts about how we work with the presentational side for Severity. So we concluded that if you hit your opponent 10 times with a sword before they go down, that doesn't really serve the dramatics that we want. I think it makes the player a bit numb or jaded to the action. So that's sort of the problem that we worked with. So as long as a character can defend, they will defend. And when their defenses are worn down, they will go down on the next strike that hits. So it becomes a sort of race against the clock to wear down defenses, and then when you actually hit, it's over. And then we used some of these things. So for rotation, it's just against your target opponent. For movement, we tried a bunch of things, but right now you're running in conflict. And there's a positioning dynamic that I think has done a lot for this, which is that you attack, you run up to your opponent, do that, and then you get an automated position that is a bit away from them. So you run away from your opponent, so you have a sort of buffer while you're charging up your next attack. And here we can see an example of this. And we've been toying a bit with the distance of this positioning. And I think the current rule of thumb is that as close as possible, but it should still look like they're keeping this defensive buffer and want to sort of run away a bit. And here we can see that when my defenses are worn down and I take another attack, the conflict is over. So yeah, I'd like to talk a bit about how stats affect the conflict dynamics. So here we can see an example character sheet, and what I'm focusing on is the stat block that is sort of mid-right here. So we have these stats that are called force, ward, speed, and burden, and I'll get into how they affect combat in the next few slides. So first of all, we have force and ward. This is the offensive and defensive stats, and hopefully that is pretty straightforward. And since these are shown for the combat assessment, like their impact needs to be super clear to the player. So the calculation on hit that we do is that the defender's ward gets subtracted by the attacker's force. And this gives me a bit of vibes of pen and paper RPGs, since it's humans who have to do these calculations in their head, and in this case, in quite a limited time, it needs to be very sort of simple of what it actually is. And then we have speed and burden, that is sort of each other's opposites. So speed makes you quicker and burden weighs you down. And for a lot of things, we use a combination value called speed burden total, where every speed you have is +1 and every burden you have is -1. And we use this a lot for counters in the conflict, and these counters then go into the action economy, like how often you can attack, which affect your chances in the conflict a lot. And this also gives us some opportunities to add some dimensions to gear usability. So you might have this really good armor that gives you a lot of ward, but it probably has a lot of burden as well, as it's a heavy armor. So this, you could just go full out and take as much burden as you can and know that you're very slow, but you can take many hits and you punch pretty hard when you do. Or you could go more towards speed and then get to hit more often, but be more frail when you're actually getting hit yourself. So stat sliders. This is a concept that I use that is a value range that is depending on the stat range. And I use it to give dynamics to the conflict and a bunch of other systems. And it can be things like time in seconds, multiplying factors, a percentage of something, and it's really just two float ranges that correlate. So if we look at a practical example, the initiative counter has a value range from 8 seconds to 1 second. And we use speed burden total for this, so it's from -9 to 20. I do clamp these. It sort of served my design purposes so far, that they don't scale indefinitely. And an example here is that a speed burden total of 2 gives you a 5.3 second initiative counter. And here we see another example of stat sliders. So what I want to focus on here is the attack counter knockback. So the mechanic is that if you have an attack counter active and you defend against an attack, you get a knockback on your attack counter. So this is based on contested force, which means it's attacker.force minus defender.force, and it's like 5 to 50% of your full attack counter that gets knocked back. And I like to use contested stats whenever I can, because of the contextualization that it's about the relative power rather than the absolute power, and especially in a situation like this with a conflict gameplay. So yeah, let's get into some bloopers. So we had a bunch of design bloopers. We've had one beta for this game, and we plan another, and that's just before launching early access. So we have a lot of sort of improvement time and feedback planned in. But I wanted to show you a bit of like our processes to give you some context to the design. So for the attack interaction, we've used this attack counter as a staple, but then we've changed a lot of things around it. So we started with a click to attack and then a crit timing. And the crit timing made you focus a lot on that and not the dramatics. So we sort of removed that. And then for a long time, we had just auto attacking and an initial click of who you wanted to attack. And this was way too passive, and we thought a lot about sort of how can we add more interaction and more choices without going like too far right on the complexity scale. One failed iteration of this was a defend interaction. So instead of automatically defending when your stats lets you, you had to sort of time this button click. And I mean, it did add more interaction, but it didn't add any interesting choices for the player. It didn't add agency. So what I think has done most for this is choosing to attack. So you might have seen from my GIFs, like when the attack counter comes up, there's a percentage in the middle. And if you wait out your full attack counter, it will go to 100%, and you will automatically charge your target opponents and get a guaranteed hit. But you can choose to attack earlier and then gamble with a D100 roll against the percentage that you currently have. And I think this gives some initiative and agency, and the conflict was so much improved when we implemented this. And I mean, even if I appreciate complex systems, presenting this choice with percentage is pretty straightforward to people. So our ambition from the start was to hide all the sort of stats and numbers from the player, and just present those values in other ways. And our fear with this was that players would focus too much on stats and math and not on the dramatics. But then when we overcompensate to this side, it just makes them confused and frustrated, and we don't want that either. So in the beginning, the pre-combat assessment was these auras that you can see. So we can see that like the right character is more powerful than the left character, and it was supposed to be like a representation of like the inner power of the character. And I really liked that, but it was super unclear. And as you can see here, does left have a chance? Like, how much of an advantage is this size difference in aura? We have no clue. So we went over to the stat blocks that I've showed you instead, and it has the same function of assessment, but it gives the player a more fair chance to understand their actual chances. So I think that's definitely an improvement. And I think it's pretty symptomatic for the design process at Might and Light that we sort of go too out on the vague and artsy, and then we have to dial it back to convention to actually make it accessible. So I'm about to wrap up, but I'll have one more slide. So I wanted to talk about some current challenges that we have. The learning curve is a big thing. I have skimmed over a lot of details. I have completely thrown out things like how skills and abilities goes into combat. So we have the issue of that this is a minor system, so the path for teaching the player this is not as straightforward as if conflict was the main component of the game. One way that we're solving this is to have jewels available in safe areas, so you can safely engage with this and try out the mechanics before you go out into more dangerous areas. And I think that having a lot of the basics automated helps as well, so you can sort of see it unfold and try to press buttons and sort of figure it out that way especially in a safe environment if you're engaging with duels. And then we're addressing that combat is not for everyone. So it's a minor system, it's optional, you can gain experience without it. And I do think that conflict is sort of a part of the base game. I also understand the people who want to be able to opt out completely. So we have these sort of vague future plans that we want conflict-free servers for the players who would prefer that. Yeah, so that's all from me, and let's go to Q&A.
Thank you for that, Jens. Very interesting, and I'm so much looking forward to start playing Book of Travels the minute I have just a little bit of spare time, which I never have. So there you go.
Yeah, especially not now.
Especially not now. Looking at the Q&A section of our Discord, there's actually no questions right now. But Jens,
yeah,
that is always a very good sign, because
I was super clear.
It means that you explained everything to the detail. Nobody needs to ask anything. They got it all served on a plate there. Anyways,
we can just start playing now.
I think it might be a little bit of a thing where, you know, people are still waking up in different time zones and whatever.
Yeah, I get that.
And for that, I want to stress again that all talks that has been live here from the studio will obviously be recorded and uploaded to our server at the end of each conference day, meaning that you can actually see all the good stuff that was live on day 1 and 2 now, and then day 3 tonight, and then everything, the entire amount of talks will be available for all pass holders until the end of June. So there's plenty of time to see all the talks, and I'm sure, Jens, that if people suddenly realize they actually do have a question for you, they will. Oh, just a minute. They were
Is
not
there, yeah.
actually. Yeah, something is happening. First of all, this game looks very cool. Art style and trying new things sounds awesome. Well, that's not a question. It's more like.
Thank you. Yeah, but it's praise. I'll eat that up.
Then there's a question from Lucas, who's asking, super cool game, looking forward to it. How do you do data modeling? Is it a spreadsheet or do you implement and tweak?
All right, so I meant data modeling in sort of how we show stats to the player and sort of how we present that. But we have one designer who has tons of spreadsheets, so I don't touch that at all. And yeah, so Excel is a big thing, and sort of trying to tweak values. Even we don't have levels, we have other factors to tweak after.
Okay, good. Thanks for that answer. And then there's another one from Jonah. Did you consider conflict mechanics which didn't involve combat?
Very conceptually. I mean, when I play pen and paper RPGs, I'm more interested in sort of social conflicts. So it was like some conceptual stages of that, but nothing that we sort of continued with.
Okay.
So not for early access, but yeah.
Then let's take a last one here. Hey, Jens is from Laura or Laura. I have a question. Do you have a suggestion on how to use physicality for adding action in a fun game, kind of like combat, without it becoming about fighting and killing? I want to have robots interacting with each other in a conflict without killing.
Yeah, I haven't thought about this, but I mean, some sort of like pushing bouncy castle situation might be a thing, and sort of you want to push your opponents into certain parts. That would be a version where it's not combat, but it's a conflict thing.
I think that sounds like a good idea as well. So Jens, I can see that time is running out for us now here, but
Yeah.
will you be available on our Discord if anyone wants to meet you and ask you questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump into the Discord and see if there's any more.
Thank you so much, Jens, and thank you for being here, being part of Nordic Game. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
And that concluded this talk by Jens from Might and Delight. We'll do a short break and be back very soon.